All right, thank you too. Welcome to your first BPAC meeting. I'll go ahead and start with the agenda. So first, I'll quickly recap our October meeting and the work we've done since. Then Ashley Reeves from our research and analytics team and I will present a bike and pedestrian crash analysis we've been working on for the past couple of weeks, which should take up most of the meeting time. And then we'll end with a preview of next steps specific to the crash analysis and give you all a chance to provide us with any updates you might have. So in October, we had William Brewer and Rochelle Carpenter from TDOT, as well as Dr. Chris Cherry from University of Tennessee, Knoxville, present some of their initial findings and an overview of their pedestrian safety crash risk factors research. And then we had Nora Curran from Walk Bike Nashville give us a presentation on Walk Bike's work towards Vision Zero and other pedestrian safety related initiatives. Since we last met, I'm happy to report that we submitted our draft regional transportation plan and all related materials for state and federal review. Again, a huge thank you to everyone on this committee for all of your hard work on the BPAC priority areas and any other active transportation elements of the plan. We'll give you a more detailed update in our January meeting. And lastly, some of you may know, but about a year ago, TDOT hired an active transportation counts coordinator, Ashley Hunter Mason, to start a counts program. We received confirmation recently that the program is going to be moving forward, and in the coming months, hopefully we will be working with you all on the BPAC to help figure out where the best locations to place those counters are so that we can all benefit from that data. So without further ado, I'll start the presentation of our bike and pedestrian crash analysis. So everyone in this group, I'm sure, is all too familiar with the current state of non-motorized safety in our region, as well as in many other regions across the country. Past few years have been some of the worst on record in terms of pedestrian fatalities, and we thought it only made sense to take a deeper dive and start with a more systemic approach to understand what risk factors are associated with bicycle and pedestrian related crashes, where those risks exist, and how we can better identify locations to focus our funds going forward. This takes a lot of coordination with a lot of stakeholders involved in non-motorized safety, which includes all of you. So Ashley is going to throw a lot of data at you today, but these conversations will continue into upcoming meetings so that we can figure out what the best strategies are for solving this crisis. I'll start with some of the most important national trends. Based on the U.S. Department of Transportation's Pedestrian Safety Action Plan, up until COVID, Americans were driving 280 million more miles than in 2012. And in 2015, with inflation, gas prices were lower than in 1947. So if more people are driving, there are more cars on the road. And if gas prices are low, this really only encourages driving more. And when more people drive, more crashes tend to happen. More people are moving to cities, putting pressure on the existing active transportation infrastructure in those areas. Nationally, in 2018, 81% of pedestrian fatalities occurred in urban areas. 74% occurred at non-intersection locations, and 76% occurred when it was dark. So what that tells us is that maybe crosswalks aren't in the right places, non-motorists aren't really visible in the dark, and the majority of fatalities have occurred in the fall and winter months, which leads to a decrease in fatalities during daylight savings time. Additionally, vulnerable populations continue to be pushed into less friendly environments to walking and biking, which has led to elderly and low-income communities bearing the brunt of fatalities. And overall highway fatalities have increased 9% between 2010 and 2019, but shockingly, pedestrian fatalities have increased 44% in the same time period. And then finally, there are more SUVs on the road than there ever have been, which could be some of the cause of the increase in bike and ped fatalities, which Dr. Chris Cherry will actually be focusing some of his efforts on in his research. But overall, the story is sadly very similar across the country. Pedestrians are getting hit and dying at very disproportionately higher rates compared to total fatalities. And those pedestrians are more likely to be in vulnerable and underserved communities. So these are some of our key regional issues and challenges associated with bike and pedestrian safety. Based on the data, there's been a much sharper increase in pedestrian fatalities, which Ashley will dig into in this presentation. But they represent less than 1% of crashes in the region, but are disproportionately impacted by crashes. In terms of population, the region is expected to grow from 1.7 million people this year to 2.7 million by 2045. And just like the national trend, more people driving likely leads to more crashes. The region has increased transit service hours, with the exception to the past 9 months or so due to COVID. But our limited active transportation network doesn't necessarily provide safe and convenient access to that transit, leaving a lot of transit-dependent folks more vulnerable and with less mobility options. And finally, only a few communities in our region have complete streets policies, and Metro Nashville is just starting work on the Only Vision Zero commitment in our region. So to frame the presentation, above the pictures on this slide are the categories we decided to sort crash risk factors into. We split this presentation up into each of these categories and have dedicated time for discussion at the end of each category. So for a quick overview, built environment and infrastructure design refers to the physical characteristics and infrastructure of roadways in the region as they relate to bike and pedestrian crashes. Roadway design, active transportation facilities, and lighting condition. Second, we looked at two of the most relevant destinations of non-motorized users, proximity to transit stops and proximity to schools. Ashley will go into more detail later in the presentation on those. And then finally, we looked at how user behavior and the geographic distribution of crashes by demographic group influences crash risk. So by taking a more systemic approach, we'll be able to not only identify locations where bike-ped crashes have been concentrated in the past, but also identify what types of risk factors are known to be associated with our regional network that will help us prioritize investments to prevent future crashes, even in locations that don't have an existing crash history. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ashley, who has done an incredible job with this analysis. Ashley?
Thank you, Daniel. So this section is going to be kind of laid out in going through the geographic distribution of crashes, then looking at the historic trend of crashes, and then going into crashes by their severity. Next slide. Here we're showing you the geographic distribution of all crashes in the region. There are, on average, 197 crashes per day, occurring largely on interstates, principal arterials, and minor arterials. Next slide. Here you can see the geographic distribution of pedestrian crashes, where we have almost 2 per day. These are heavily concentrated in downtown centers and along major pikes and corridors. Next slide. Here we have the geographic distribution of bike crashes. There are roughly 151 per year that tend to be heavily concentrated in urban centers, and they tend to get more random in distribution outside of those urban areas. Next slide. Here we're looking at annual totals for motorist in gray and non-motorist in orange. The annual totals have remained fairly constant over the past 5 years. Non-motorized crashes account for 1% of the crashes within the region. Next slide. And when we look at just non-motorist, we can see that there are roughly 600 pedestrian crashes per year and over 100 bike crashes per year. This trend has remained fairly consistent over the past 5 years. Next slide. Crashes by severity by mode. So when we look at crashes by severity by mode, we see that even though non-motorists consist of a lower percentage of all crashes, as the crashes become more severe, bike and pedestrian crashes start to account for a much larger percentage. Next slide. Looking at the locations of those severe pedestrian crashes, we see that they are representative of the distribution of all pedestrian crashes, with about 138 occurring every year. Next slide. And we can see that the locations of severe bike crashes, we see that they are much more random in distribution, and they occur at a lot less frequency, at about 19 per year. Next slide. Here we're looking at the trend of non-motorized and motorized fatal crashes. Non-motorized fatalities account for approximately 20% of the fatal crashes in the region. It's important to note that fatalities resulting from all modes of transportation increased on average 7%, while bike ped, on the other hand, increased at about 14%. Next slide. If we look at bike versus pedestrian, we see that there is a steady increase in the number of pedestrian fatalities and relatively low bike fatalities. Next slide. Now we're looking at serious injuries, and we can see that for motorists, there was a significant decrease between 2017 and 2018, but for non-motorists, it has remained fairly constant. It's also important to note that serious injuries in all modes of transportation in the region decreased by 8%, bike ped only decreased by 3%. Next slide. And then if we look at bike versus pedestrian, we can see that both have remained fairly consistent over the past 5 years. And then to Daniel for key takeaways and discussion.
All right, thanks, Ashley. So for a quick recap, non-motorized crashes are a small percentage of total crashes, but are more likely to be severe. Total fatalities increased on average about 7% between 2015 and 2019, but pedestrian fatalities nearly doubled. And then for serious injuries, there was a 3% reduction on average between 2015 and 2019 in bike ped serious injuries, but an 8% reduction in all serious injuries. So does anyone have any questions or immediate reactions?
Daniel, William Anderson, do you have any idea of the number of crashes that haven't been reported? Any ideas?
Ashley, you want to take that one?
I wouldn't be able to speak to how many go unreported just because I'm only working out of the Department of Safety Titan database, which uses local police departments' data for accidents. So I don't necessarily have enough information to be able to even guesstimate how many are underreported, but I'm assuming that it happens often.
Daniel, I think Knoxville MPO or Knoxville TPO did a little bit more work in looking into the number of crashes that go unreported. I forget the actual percentage, but I wanted to say that it was significant, maybe like even up to half. Is that my off base on that?
No, that sounds about right. I remember talking to Ellen, their bike ped planner, a few weeks ago, and she said that there was a very large percentage that went unreported.
Yeah, Daniel, Sean, that's what I was recollecting as well out of Knoxville.
Yeah, and for the most part, for fatalities and serious injuries, those are pretty well reported just because they usually require medical attention or some sort of ambulance or something along those lines. But for just crashes in general, I would say they were vastly underreported.
All right, any other questions or thoughts on this section?
This is Bob Murphy. I had a question. I was wondering, you looked further as far as location as opposed, so you see the breakdown of like intersection or crosswalk versus non-crosswalk or intersection crashes.
Yeah, we'll be going into that in the next section. Any other questions? All right, I'll go ahead and move on. So now that we've gone through the sort of high-level analysis, we can dive into the built environment and infrastructure design category. These are physical road network and land use factors and their effect on crash risk. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Daniel. You want to go to the next slide? Okay. So this section is going to be set up by roadway design, and in that section, we're going to cover urban versus rural functional classification, speed limit, travel lanes, signalized intersections, and lighting condition. And then we'll go into the active transportation facilities such as sidewalks and bike lanes. If you want to go to the next slide. And so just to give you guys a heads up, from this point on, we're now looking at percent of total in these graphs instead of just the actual raw values in the previous graphs. So for this one, we're looking at percent of total roadway miles, bike crashes, and pedestrian crashes. Occasionally, that gray bar will change to percentage of total bike and pedestrian crashes. But in this particular case, it is roadway mileage because we wanted to see if there were any disproportionate areas. So when we're looking at urban versus rural roads, we see that there are a disproportionate number of bike and pedestrian crashes occur on urban roads. Next slide. So then we looked at urban roads by functional classification. So we have expressways, interstates, principal arterials, which include your pikes such as Gallatin Pike, minor arterials such as Granny White Pike, major collectors such as Trousdale, minor collectors, and local roads. So you can see from this graph, a majority of severe pedestrian crashes occur on principal arterials and local roads. You have so many more on local since there are so many more local roads in the region, and there's a higher use of local roads for pedestrian activity. However, pedestrian crashes are disproportionately higher than the roadway mileage for principal arterials and are more fatal. Next slide. And the exact same thing could be said for bike crashes as well. Next slide. Then we looked at pedestrian crashes by road speed limit. They are generally happening on roads where speed limits are between 25 to 40 miles per hour. It appears as though there are more crashes at lower speed limits, but more severe at higher speed limits. Next slide. For bike crashes, you see the distribution is more so occurring between the 25 to 55 miles per hour. Next slide. Here we took a look at travel lanes. There is a large number occurring on two-lane roads, but that is likely because there are so many two-lane roads across the region. What is more interesting to note is that there is a disproportionately higher number of bike and pedestrian crashes on four-lane roads than roadway miles. Next slide. Here we can see that over half of bike and pedestrian crashes are occurring within 500 feet of a signalized intersection. Next slide. Then we took a look at severity by lighting. And so you have dawn, daylight, dusk, dark, and unknown lighting. These come from the Titan database. So you can see that a larger percentage of them are happening during daylight and dark, and a larger portion of severe crashes are happening at dark. So then we took a look at lighting conditions at dark. If you go to the next slide. And when looking at whether or not there was lighting, a larger percentage occur when there is lighting indicated, but there is still a significant number that occur where there is no lighting. Next slide. Bike crashes largely occur during the daylight, but that's probably due to more people biking during the day. But there's also a significant number occurring when it is dark. Next slide. A large majority of fatal bike crashes are occurring where it is dark and there is no lighting. And the next slide, we'll go into active transportation facilities. Here you can see there's a disproportionate number of bike and pedestrian crashes occurring within 500 feet of a sidewalk. Next slide. You can also see that there's a disproportionate number of bike ped crashes occurring within 500 feet of a bike facility. This does include wide outside lanes and signed shared routes. And then before I give it to Daniel, I think there was a question in the chat box. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think I saw a question.
Oh yes, it was from Sean. It was to BPAC members.
Okay, so Sean is asking if BPAC members have observed any potentially contributing to the higher rate of pedestrian serious injuries on local roads because of speeding on local roads. Anyone want to respond to that? Oh, Nora did. Nora, you can go ahead if you.
Oh, well, yeah, I was just saying we have seen that some in Nashville. We've been using streetlight data to run some speed comparative studies and have seen speeds higher on local roads. But the one other thing we've seen we have seen more fatal crashes in Nashville, and most of those continue to not be on local roads. I think it's about 80 or 85% are on arterials and collectors.
Thanks, Nora. All right, so I'll move to just the takeaways and we can have a discussion. I know we've presented a lot of data thus far, but to reiterate, a lot of the bike ped fatalities occur disproportionately on principal arterials, which are the Pikes, Charlotte Pike, Nolensville Pike, Dickerson Pike. And then, so, I mean, why are principal arterials the most dangerous? Is it number of lanes, insufficient crossing, or facility infrastructure, vehicle speed? Those are things we'd like to discuss. And then 4-lane roadways are disproportionately dangerous for non-motorized users. There aren't that many 4-lane roadways, but we're seeing lots of severe bike ped crashes on those roadways. They represent only a third of bike ped crashes, nearly a third of bike ped crashes, but only account for 5% of roadway miles. And then there's a spike in crashes, especially with pedestrians at 35-mile-an-hour speed limits and faster. And as you would expect, as the speed limit increases, we're seeing more pedestrian fatalities. And then finally, the majority of ped fatalities occur in dark conditions. I think it was 80% of pedestrian fatalities occur in dark conditions. So if anyone has any immediate reactions or questions or thoughts, we'll pause here for a discussion.
I was curious. This is Evan Espy. I represent the disability community on this committee. I was curious if any of this data was broken down, or if the data was available to see if any of these fatalities or incidents involve people with disabilities at crosswalks or who had been hit just going down the sidewalk or the side of the road. And I'll mute back again.
Hey, Evan, I think you cut out in the middle of that. Could you repeat that question?
Yes, sorry. I was just curious if any of this data had been broken down to show if any of these fatalities involved people with disabilities or pedestrians with disabilities. And if not, was just curious if that potential data was available or not. And did you hear everything, Daniel?
Yeah, so that is actually something we looked at. That's going to be in our last section. So we'll go through that later in this presentation, but good question.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have it as an actual data point of the pedestrian or the bicyclist, if whether or not they were disabled, but we did take a look at disabled populations in a later section. So we do kind of address that issue, but not necessarily as a specific data point, if that makes sense.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for that clarification, Ashley.
This is Councilwoman Henderson. I am new to Teams, and so I can't see if there's a raised hand function. So I hope it's okay just to unmute and speak. My question is around policy, and that's some of my primary interest in serving on this committee. But I wonder at both, the state and local level, when you were sharing some of the data, I noticed that invariably after it, there was kind of a caveat, we're seeing more of this here, but that's because, this circumstance or that circumstance. And so I wonder, do we have any kind of a clearinghouse or resource for the various municipalities or counties or cities, around how what's guiding their infrastructure? So, no shared infrastructure above a certain mile per hour, no shared bicycle infrastructure without street lighting, just setting some thresholds or standards, because I feel like on state routes, especially, sometimes we have this kind of share the road on a 40 mile per hour 4-lane road, which obviously is not safe. And so I'm wondering if through policy we can set some standards that will begin to kind of move how we do infrastructure. Thank you. Interested in anyone's thoughts on that.
A really great point, and I think that's something that we want to get into with this analysis, is trying to figure out how we can implement policies and create new policies that will make these locations safer. So from a principal arterials point of view, those are TDOT roads, and so a lot of those designs go through the TDOT multimodal design guidelines. And we've had a lot of conversations in this committee in previous meetings on updating those design guidelines. So hopefully that is something that we will discuss going forward with this analysis, is using the data that we've produced to help inform safer facilities on specific roads that are experiencing a disproportionate number of pedestrian and bicyclist crashes and fatalities. Does that answer your question?
It does. And Daniel, are those multimodal design guidelines updated annually? Or, I mean, is there a standard process for them to be updated, or is it just as needed?
I'm not sure. Rochelle, are you on the call? Do you want to take that question?
Daniel, I don't see Rochelle on the call. Is there anybody else from TDOT that might want to take that question? I think Ian might be on the call.
Hey, this is Ian. Can you repeat that?
Yes, my question was, Daniel was speaking to the committee previously. Again, this is my first time attending, being engaged around the multimodal design guidelines at TDOT, and wanting to be further engaged. And my question was, are they updated annually? Is it on any particular schedule? Just so I kind of understand the time horizon on that for our engagement.
Yeah, totally. No problem. Thanks, Councilwoman Anderson. Those are great questions. I'm going to get with Rochelle probably in an email, and I will follow up with you. I've got your email address, and I will answer those questions because she can take them better than I can.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts? All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next section. So now we'll dive into the destinations associated with non-motorized crashes, specifically proximity to transit stops and proximity to schools. You can go ahead and take it away, Ashley.
Okay, first we're going to look at crashes by proximity to transit stop. Here you can see that there's a disproportionately higher number of bike and pedestrian crashes occurring within 500 feet of a transit stop. Next slide. So most school zones are about a quarter mile, and you can see school zones, they're doing something right, because you see a significant jump in pedestrian crashes just when you exit those school zones. And you can see the same thing on the next slide with bike crashes as well. And we can move into key takeaways if you want to, Daniel.
Sure. So school zones work. There's a dramatic increase in crashes outside of school zones. So is that enforcement, street calming measures like signs and crossing guards, or is it public awareness? I think a lot of these are likely working in tandem to ensure that areas surrounding schools are safe. But in contrast, over half of crashes near transit occur near transit stops, 60% within 1,000 feet. So I think this tells us that we need to further analyze this, see where people are most likely to cross when they board the bus or when they get off the bus, where the popular destinations after transit riders get off a transit vehicle. And I think one thing this tells us is that building new shelters isn't necessarily enough. We need to make sure that accessing the transit stop and surrounding attractions is also safe. So that goes back to my earlier point of making sure that all stakeholders are involved so we can get local transit agencies like WeGo involved in making access to transit much safer. Does anyone else have any questions or immediate thoughts?
Hey Daniel, this is Sean from FHWA. The school zone takeaway is interesting to me, and I get it and I understand it. You know, I wonder how that might be communicated with the policy board and the technical committee, because I know I seem to recall at least one policy board meeting where one of the one of the board members did mention about school zones being a contributor to congestion, and so we've kind of got conflicting priorities there, and so I wonder how some of the policymakers might react and kind of consider this,
Yeah, that's a good point, Sean. And I think the congestion point speaks to why school zones, or at least one reason why school zones could be safer. I think people, or at least drivers, are very aware of school zones and know to slow down. But the same is not necessarily true about people that are riding transit. So, I mean, I think it's something that we definitely will need to communicate to our Transportation Policy Board and TCC, but that's a good point. Anyone else have any other questions?
To me, it almost makes a case too for like dedicated transit lane hours, similar to like an HOV lane, but for like peak hours, if transit's mostly being used for commutes or something, to create those dedicated lanes so that there's less conflict, at least surrounding the stops for when they may go to their destination. Kind of like a school zone, but for transit at certain hours.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carson. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways we should take from this is how can we replicate the clearly, like, traffic calming measures work? How can we replicate those in relation to transit?
Daniel, the only thing I'd add too is that I think with a lot of this analysis, we're still scratching the surface, and it'd be interesting for us to take an even more detailed look at particular transit stops that are, even more problematic, where more crashes are occurring, and be able to share that information with you all in WeGo to highlight some of those problem areas.
Good point, Sean, and I'll reiterate that this conversation does not stay in this meeting. We'll continue this in the upcoming meetings. This is really just the beginning analysis that we've done.
This is Justin at WeGo. I will just chime in and say, as part of the Better Bus website that we had put together, one of the things we did include in there was a map that sort of showed collisions involving pedestrians along with our ridership, a heat map of our ridership, and it really does stand out in some of those busiest ridership areas. That they are often the sites of a lot of accidents where pedestrians are getting hit. So yeah, just wanted to highlight that, and then certainly that's something that as we upgrade stops, like we're currently doing in Nolensville, we're trying to work closely with Public Works and with TDOT to make sure that we can implement our design guidelines, and to the extent that we can, making sure we're getting getting the pedestrian access improvements that are needed to improve safety.
Thanks, Justin. Would you mind putting the story map for the Better Bus in the chat?
Yeah, I can do that.
Great, thank you.
This is Councilwoman Henderson again. So I represent a largely suburban district, and so I've had some concern around where transit stops are located on state routes. Somebody made a good suggestion earlier about the having dedicated transit lanes and how that might be helpful, and I concur. But I see also in these really big wide intersections with slip lanes that are already really hard for pedestrians to get across. So one of the biggest bus routes in my district is the Bellevue. We go Route 5, and so that stop is well back from the intersection because of the placement of a slip lane, and thus everybody gets off the bus and dashes across 6 many lanes because of the turn lane in the center, to an adjacent Kroger parking lot that is an unofficial park and ride. And so I'm interested to understand kind of the intersection of local transit planning with TDOT standards and how kind of intersection standards are set to support transit, because I feel like we already have intersections that are the walk times aren't sufficient for elderly and disabled to get across. And so there's obviously it's an intersection literally and figuratively, but I'm also interested in that from a design perspective. Thank you.
Hey, Councilwoman, this is Ian from TDOT again. I might be able to make a comment on that. So you're right, there are a lot of hotspots that make it over to Metro, and of course GNRC, and whenever TDOT, certainly on state routes, we work with the locals all the time in resurfacing projects and incorporating multimodal design guidelines of our own. Whenever we do certain updates, of course everything has to be ADA compliant. That's a given. But if there are bigger concerns that aren't reaching the folks that it needs to when it comes time to implement certain improvements or projects, feel free to reach out to us and make us aware so that we can get our project development folks. If it's on a local road, just a reminder, Metro planning would be the point of contact for that. But of course, myself and my staff at TDOT in our community outreach office is happy to sit in on those communications so that we can incorporate them, so that we can have a more comprehensively inclusive design process for those intersections you're talking about. Maybe I can email you, or you can email me with some of those specific ones, and we can figure it out for you if they lie on a local road or a TDOT road. I'd be happy to help with that. Is any of that helpful, or did I completely miss the mark?
No, absolutely. It certainly is. I'm just thinking, I think as a local council member, when we look at, infrastructure, I have satellite cities, we have metro government, we have TDOT routes, we have local routes. And I feel like I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that things are in alignment. Like, when there's a local sidewalk project that's going to intersect a TDOT route, and I know that I've got people on a sidewalk that I want to get over into the park, but I've got to get them across a TDOT slip lane that I don't want to be there. And then how do I navigate that with our local public works department to engage TDOT to consider taking out the slip lane, and what are the knock-on effects of that? And so, obviously you just need a much kind of lengthier horizon, I think, from a planning standpoint. And as I understand it, TDOT now is giving a longer horizon for repaves and so forth. So I just think, just systemic process things are really important to get all this design aligned. So I appreciate that, Ian. I'll follow up with you. And and I just want to make sure that what I'm thinking about it just for my district. I recognize it's replicable at any intersection in Nashville, Murfreesboro, Williamson County. It all correlates. So thank you so much.
Anytime. And you're absolutely right. To get everyone on the same page for certain improvements like this should be a lot easier. We were on a call earlier about adding bike lanes to a resurfacing project that's coming up in March on Lafayette Street, and we just got to be aware of if Metro has designs or plans or something that's also along the state route. I mean, it would be great if, we all knew about that ahead of time, but largely that's on TDOT too, to understand that, these places don't operate in a vacuum. So that just goes to say that communication can always be improved, and that's why our office is here. So please don't hesitate to make us aware of any of that. So absolutely great points. Completely agree. We're always trying to improve. Thanks, Councilwoman.
Councilwoman Henderson, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think these are really the exact questions we're trying to answer. So for those intersections you're talking about, like, what are the best safety countermeasures that we can implement there, and how can we get involved earlier in the design process so we can ensure and make sure that we're looking at all of the data to understand exactly where we would need to put a median, or exactly where we would need to put a crosswalk to go to the Kroger, for example, so that transit riders know that they're protected instead of having to dash across the street and risk getting hit, which actually end up being so many of our pedestrian serious injuries and fatalities.
Hey guys, this is Michael Briggs with Vanderbilt. I'm curious, particularly within the crashes at Metro, if we've looked at them by the community plan designation. So seeing if there is a correlation between land uses that are trending more towards urban mixed use, and because I think that's an interesting way to potentially look at like the school zone concept, and there's certain kind of features of a school zone that probably should be replicated in some of these areas that have land uses that are trending more towards walkable, mixed use connected neighborhoods. And I'm sure there's a way outside of Metro, like looking into some of our outlying counties where they have like village centers as well, to where there could be some policy guidance for the region. Looking at best practices around like the operations of roads in those mixed use districts, like related to speed or traffic signalization, and then also the roadway design. So that might be another kind of land use component that you could begin to tie to the pedestrian and bike crashes across the region.
That's a great point, Michael. Does anyone else have any thoughts before we move on to the next section? All right, I'll go ahead and move on. So this is our last section, so we'll dive into the behavior section. In interest of time, I'll just let Ashley take over.
Okay, did you want to introduce the vulnerable populations, or did you want me to?
Oh yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay.
So in August, we presented to you all on social equity issues and trends, which put a framework in place for us to analyze regional issues in relation to vulnerable populations. So we focused on 9 traditionally underserved or vulnerable populations. These populations have physical, economic, educational, and other challenges that disproportionately affect their quality of life. So those 9 populations are racial minorities, ethnic minorities, families in poverty, limited English-speaking households, disability community, senior populations, unemployed single mother households, and zero-car households. So we defined vulnerable areas as an area where a vulnerable population is above the regional average. And then we defined the degrees of vulnerability to identify areas where populations of traditionally underserved individuals reside in the region. These 9 population groups make up the degrees of vulnerability index, meaning a block group can have anywhere from 0 to 9 populations above the regional average. And of the regional's block groups, about 20% were defined as highly vulnerable, meaning an area with 6 or more degrees of vulnerability. So this ended up in 21 highly vulnerable areas, which Ashley will now go through in relation to bike-ped crashes.
Awesome, thank you, Daniel. Here you can see the locations of those highly vulnerable areas that Daniel was just referring to, which contain 5 or more degrees of vulnerability. We have about 21 highly vulnerable areas within our region. And to make it easier to evaluate, we lumped together clusters of these highly vulnerable block groups based on their geography by either neighborhood or surrounding areas, thus creating these 21 highly vulnerable areas. Next slide. When comparing bike and pedestrian crashes to overall crashes, the area that they make up within the region, as well as the population within highly vulnerable areas, only 17% of the population live in HVAs, but 41% of the pedestrian fatalities occur in these areas. You can also see that 20% of crashes occur in HVAs, but a third of bike and pedestrian crashes occur in these areas. And of the factors included in HVAs, disabled, racial minority, ethnic minority, carless, and poverty contain the largest percentage of pedestrian crashes. If you want to go to the next slide. Here we see where crashes are happening at a block group level. 41% are happening in highly vulnerable areas, but you can see that in the outlined areas, but also happening outside of those HVAs. So we wanted to look at the individual groups that make up the vulnerable areas, because they're not just happening only in HVAs, they're happening everywhere. Which takes me to my next slide, which I think is slightly jaw-dropping. So then we took a look at those non-disadvantaged populations to see the crash distribution in comparison to the population each group represents. This graph shows that every single degree of vulnerability factor is affected disproportionately. And there's a majority happening in at least one vulnerable area for pedestrian crashes. And then the next slide, you can see the same is true for bicycle crashes as well. Next slide. So we look at free flow speed is a term used to describe the average speed that a motorist would travel if there were no congestion. 70% or below is defined as congested. The majority of crashes are happening in congested conditions. Conditions are safer both when uncongested or at gridlock. However, conditions at or near free flow speed are slightly less safe. Next slide. What I think is most interesting about bike crashes and free flow is the spike we see with fatal bike crashes that occur when people are allowed to travel at or near free flow. Next slide. Here we looked at pedestrian crashes by severity by vehicle type. So we looked at motorcycle, passenger cars, pickup panels, vans, buses, trucks that are light duty, which are 2-axle trucks, medium duty, 3-axle trucks, heavy duty, 4-axle trucks. Most pedestrian crashes involve passenger vehicles, but you do see a significant number occurring involving trucks and pickup panels and vans. Next slide. For bikes, we see a similar trend, but with a significant number of severe crashes involving larger trucks. Next slide. Then we took a look at crashes month by month. Nothing really sticks out, but remember the discussion we had in the lighting condition. And so a lot of crashes are happening at night. So we wanted to see if daylight savings time was going to play a role. So on the next slide, we took a look at crashes happening only at night. And we can see an increase in crashes and severe crashes in the winter months where it gets darker earlier. Next slide. Here we looked at hit and runs for bicyclists and pedestrians. While more crashes aren't necessarily a hit and run, but there is a noticeable difference in bike versus pedestrian, with a higher percentage of fatalities being a hit and run. Next slide. We looked at impaired drivers for bike and pedestrian involvement. You can see a significant number of severe crashes involve an impaired driver, even though a majority of your crashes do not involve an impaired driver. And then I will give it to Daniel to give you some key takeaways and open up for discussion.
Thanks, Ashley. So that was a lot of data. If anyone wants me to go back to any of the slides, I think I'm going to go back to the vulnerable population slide. I think those are, as Ashley said, very jaw-dropping. So even though every single one of these populations are minorities of the total population, they almost all represent disproportionate amounts of, or disproportionate numbers of pedestrian crashes. And then here's bike crashes again.
And Daniel, this is Nora from Walk Bike Nashville. I just had a quick question on this. Is this, can you remind us, is this based on where the crashes occur and if in that area there's a higher percentage of people who are carless, or is it looking at like specific details known about the victims?
Ashley, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's just based on the crash occurred in.
Correct. The area. So it's in the areas where carless households are higher than the regional average.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
And again, I'll reiterate that, where did it go? HVAs only represent 6% of the total region area and 17% of the population. But as we can see, 41% of pedestrian fatalities. So this really is some shocking numbers that I haven't seen before. So I'll go back to the key takeaways slide. So again, 41% fatalities occur in HVAs. I think this is very troubling, and I think it means we need to prioritize eliminating inequities in our planning process and solutions to bike and pedestrian safety so that not owning a car isn't a death sentence. And then again, there's an increased pedestrian crash severity during winter months without the daylight savings time. So I'll open it up for discussion if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
I just have a question. I think Ashley's brought this up before, that the crash data reports don't typically give details about the demographics of who was involved in the crash.
It does, but there's some overlapping in categories that I have found and some inconsistencies where the data is null. So it's spotty at best.
Gotcha.
So Daniel, you want to move on to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay. So we did a sort of what I would call a desktop review where we went through and analyzed characteristics from the top crash areas, whether it be top pedestrian crash, top bike crash, top fatal pedestrian crash locations. And we looked at the characteristics at each of those individual locations. So here you're seeing an overview of Trinity Lane I-65 interchange, which is one of our top fatal pedestrian locations. And some of the characteristics that were gleaned at this location were that transit stops were in close proximity. You had commercial in relation to residential. You had near vulnerable populations. And one really kind of interesting finding was near homeless tent communities living off of the interchanges. That happened pretty, substantially. Sidewalk or bike facilities were nearby, and that there were designated turn lanes. And if you want to go to the next slide. We applied this through the top areas across the region and found common characteristics across all of these different areas, which were that transit stops were close by, commercial was near residential, where you had on-street parking garages or lots, near vulnerable populations, as well as homeless communities, which we don't have census information on, but we just noticed from satellite imagery. Pedestrian signals and crosswalks were nearby, not necessarily in every single location along these areas, but they were prominent. Sidewalk or bike facilities were nearby, and there were designated turn lanes. And Daniel, you can go to the next slide. think this is back to you.
Thanks, Ashley. So I'll reiterate that all the data that we've presented thus far has only been up until the end of 2019. And so we realize that this year is different than most. And since March, we've been paying close attention to how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the region's transportation system and the trends associated with it. So there's been a widespread use of telecommuting. This committee has been meeting virtually since March. And I think everyone has noticed the changing congestion trends throughout the region. There's been a growing demand for delivery, which means that people are making less trips because they can get things delivered to their home. There's been a huge surge in active transportation activity. I think we've got Juliet from Streetlight on the call. They've had a lot of reports on surge in bike and pedestrian use across the country. I think in the state, the most was in Knoxville. And then we recently got access to Strava's data and have seen a huge increase in bike and pedestrian use. And so we're looking to look more into that with the data that we just received, and hopefully next meeting we'll be able to present some of that data to you. In addition, there's been a hesitancy for riders to return to transit. I don't remember the exact number, but Justin, I think at one of our CMP meetings, you mentioned specific percentage decline in ridership.
Yeah, and so I'll caution that I haven't looked at data for the past couple of weeks yet, but we had been fairly consistently hovering around a 50% decline in ridership, though that is not at all evenly spread across our system. So particularly routes that tended to carry more weekday peak commuters have a much greater decline, and even just sections of routes or sections of our system where that was a higher percentage of ridership. We've seen more declines there. But yeah, and then of course in some places, particularly in places with higher proportion of low-income residents with essential services, we see a lower than average ridership decline. So, but overall, 50% is roughly where we're at.
Thanks, Justin. So, and then finally, we've seen a decline in tax revenue. If less people are driving, there's less gas tax, for example, and then that can lead to a delay of transportation investments. And then we've seen an increase in crash severity despite a reduction in crashes, especially among non-motorized. I think so far this has been one of the worst years on record. And so I'll go to the next slide. So this chart shows up until November 30th of this year. This is statewide. As you can see, this year's curve is following the shape of the 3-year average, but it's much more exaggerated. So the darker gray curve is 2017 to 2019 average, and the lighter gray is 2020 of this year. I think one thing to note is the dramatic increase right after Halloween, so right up here. So again, this goes till November 30th. Does anyone have any thoughts? All right, if no one has any thoughts or questions, I'll move on to the last slide. So in the upcoming meetings, as I mentioned, we'll dive into a bike ped safety index that Ashley and the data team have been working hard on. Well, I think we'll also have discussions on how we can work together with you all on the best ways to implement solutions using the analysis we've conducted. That may turn into a list of countermeasures that we can then prioritize. It may turn into something similar to that. but just wanted to preview the next steps related to today's presentation and how we hope to use this data going forward.
Daniel, this is Sean with GNRC. The only thing I'd add, just from today's discussion as well, is the importance of process and how do we coordinate the appropriate stakeholders in implementing a lot of these solutions. And so that might be another thing that we wanted to highlight as part of these next steps of working with the data to help identify solutions and implement them.
Thanks, Sean. It's a good point. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions on today's presentation? I know it was a lot to present, but we're really excited about how we can use this data going forward.
And I think if folks have any additional questions or thoughts that come up that they would like us to explore, as Daniel and Ashley have said, there's still another layer of detail I think that we can go into with this information. And so just feel free to shoot us any ideas or thoughts that you have as you get an opportunity to kind of think on this a little bit.
Well, we have the opportunity to review the bike ped crash analysis again.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to make a PDF of the PowerPoint slides and send it to everyone on this meeting.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Absolutely. And there will also be a recording of the meeting as well if you were overwhelmed by the amount of data we presented. So if nobody else has any other questions, I'll open it up for anyone in the committee who has any updates on things they're working on or any final questions.
Hey, Daniel, I wonder if you would want to mention about the Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian workshop that we had a meeting on recently.
Sure. So recently we met with VHB, I think was the consultant that is representing FHWA. And so FHWA has a safe travel for every pedestrian. And we're going to be working with them in the future to hopefully bring a workshop to both this committee, BPAC, and eventually our Transportation Policy Board and Transportation Coordinating Committee to talk about what the best safety countermeasures are that we can be implementing going forward. Did I miss anything, Sean?
No, for anyone that's interested in advance of, the formal notice, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian is an initiative, sort of a safety countermeasure type initiative where there are specific countermeasures that are proven to have pedestrian safety benefits that FHWA encourages and promotes. And so as part of this, GNRC as well as the other MPOs across the state have we're bringing these workshops, and we want to tailor it to what the local and regional priorities are. So I appreciate the update there, Daniel, but just keep an ear out, I guess.
Hey, Daniel, this is Ian. Can I give an update?
Sure, go for it, Ian.
So TDOT's Pedestrian Road Safety Initiative has had some updates, and apologies. Rochelle Carpenter and William Brewer in our Data Viz office would be the best equipped to give this. But basically, I think that the long and short is in Data Viz and our multimodal division have been putting together some environmental justice indices rather, that kind of maps a lot of the data that your data team has been putting together over the last several months, and I think there might be some opportunity for collaboration. If there's not already, forgive me if I'm being redundant here, but I just wanted to make folks aware that TDOT has a pedestrian road safety initiative that we usually talk about on the call, and I'm going to put Will's and Rochelle's email in the chat box so that folks can reach out to them directly for updates on that. But just wanted to mention it. Appreciate it. That's all I got.
Thanks, Ian. Anyone else have any updates? All right, well, if that is all the updates for now, I think we'll go ahead and close out the meeting a little bit early. If anyone has any questions on today's presentation or wants clarification, please email me or Ashley, and we will do our best to answer any of your questions. I'll be sending out a recording of the meeting as well as the slides so you guys can digest all the data that we presented today. But if everyone is okay with adjourning the meeting early, happy holidays, and hope everyone is able to stay safe and healthy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Daniel.